Today I want to sit down and bring you guys some of my thoughts on Bend Studios' recent open-world zombie survival experience, Days Gone. This has been, without a doubt, one of the most divisive gaming experiences I've personally had in a very long time. My time with Days Gone has been one hell of a roller coaster, full of ups and downs, frustrations, and moments of fun. The game seems to constantly be at odds with itself. There's a lot of what I believe to be genuinely poor game design here, game design that feels outdated in some cases, and game design that often feels like it's been put there specifically to pad out the experience and at the end of the day, waste a lot of the player's time. One of the biggest issues I have with the game in its current state is that it seems like everything was at one point much closer together when it comes to progression, both for the game's story, its many larger scale missions, as well as things like upgrades to different crafting components, the motorcycle itself, and so much more happening with Deacon and his skill tree. It's as if everything was maybe right where it should have been or in a much better place than it is now, but it was eventually stretched out and elongated. It means that a lot of the progression you experience in even the first 10 hours of the game happens at an absolute snail's pace. In order to gain access to a lot of the upgrades for your bike, you have to spend a lot of time grinding out reputation and currency for the different camps that exist in the world of Days Gone. It's not a fun thing to do, and I haven't really done much of it, which means that there's some inconsistencies with the things that I have available for my motorcycle and the areas that I'm actually then riding the bike in. It's something we'll get to a little bit more later on, because I really did want to spend the majority of this video focusing on the things that I actually really like about Days Gone, the things that might drive you to actually purchase this game, whether it's now or when it's on sale down the road, and actually have a pretty good time with it. If there's one thing about Days Gone that has really continued to bring me back, that's kept me playing among the many frustrations I have with it, it's the fact that Days Gone really does seem to be one of the first genuine open world survival horror games that I've ever played. I know a lot of you will probably mention something like Evil Within 2 and other games with like pseudo open worlds, but Days Gone is a proper large scale open world akin to the one you might find in a game like Assassin's Creed. We don't typically find survival horror not done to the level I think it's being done here in Days Gone in those sorts of games, and that's honestly the thing that impresses me the most about this experience, is just how oppressive and dark the world actually is. And I don't mean it's full of like ultra violence and everybody's getting their slit all the time. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's violence in Days Gone, but where The Last of Us and The Last of Us 2 seems to be using violence as a way to portray a sense of horror and fear in their worlds, Days Gone doesn't really need to do any of that to bring true terror to its open world environment. I think it does that a little bit more delicately, and this is probably where some of the best bits of design within the Days Gone experience exists. So that's what we're going to focus on today, because there's a lot of reasons that a player might play a proper survival horror game, a game like the most recent Resident Evil 2 remake, Evil Within, as I mentioned earlier, games like classic RE, Amnesia, Outlast. These games deliver extremely oppressive experiences that fill us with that gut-wrenching sense of doom and terror, experiences that you just don't find in any other genre for the most part. There's just something about feeling very uncomfortable almost all of the time when you play a survival horror game, and Days Gone totally has that mood. It does it through its music, which is fantastically implemented into its open world. There are a lot of more key vocal pieces they use throughout the story and certain missions, but the general atmospherics are really strong while not really being that noticeable. You won't really notice a particular song or a particular tune kicking in, but when you're cruising your way through the woods and there's this soft, meaty bass playing in the back of some ambient soundtrack, it really does lend itself to make the world feel like a slightly more terrifying place to be, and I really do like that. If there is one element that has really only kind of sprung to my mind, I guess you could say, in the last 5 hours I've been playing the game. It's the way, like, difficulty with the zombies themselves is scaled. And I think this is truly at the heart of what gives Days Gone that survival horror flair. Like everything else, the music and, the open world design and the presentation and, like, the sense of, like, survival, everyone's just trying to make it out here on their own and just live the best life they can live. That definitely has something to do with it. But I think it has a lot to do with how the world then interacts with the player. I think this is usually the most important part of creating a survival horror experience. And in Days Gone, taking on a few zombies, or a few freakers as they refer to them in their world, isn't really a difficult thing, especially on normal difficulty. Just hack them up with a baseball bat, repair that baseball bat, or replace it later on. Small groups of freakers are really not that challenging to deal with, and the majority of your experience can be played in avoiding the freakers pretty much altogether. You can even clear out the many nests that exist in the infected zones simply by rushing in, throwing Molotovs, and then getting the hell out of Dodge. As long as you plan things appropriately, it's really not that hard to pull off. But in those moments when you do get overwhelmed by even a small horde of maybe 20 or less than that in some cases, you die rather quickly. And when you run into the serious hordes of many hundred freakers, that's where the shit really hits the fan. And this is where I think they've done such an outstanding job with their survival horror elements. You really do feel like you're going about and you can kind of sneak and slither your way through the world, just barely surviving. But the existence of larger hordes ranging from, a dozen to many hundred is just kind of always lurking in the back of your head. And it takes a few hours of playing Days Gone to get to that point where you're finally punished by a smaller group of freakers or a very large group in the form of a horde for that whole sense of terror to kick in. But once it does, it really does alter the rest of your experience with the game. Now when you're driving along down a dark road near a Nero camp, you think a little bit harder about, I wonder where that horde is. I know there's a cave around here. Also, the fact that the freakers, like, basically go sleep in caves, and you can walk into these caves and just find hundreds of them and wake them up, is absolutely freaking terrifying. The people of the world also do an outstanding job of adding a true sense of dread and horror to the existence of the zombies, the freakers themselves, by describing them so horridly. These descriptions of bodily fluids and rotting flesh and just decaying material, these massive trails of what seem to be literally blood, guts, and piss that they leave behind in their wakes. It all sounds extremely awful, and there are moments when the characters are moving in on a nest and they just, sort of in disgust, where it's almost like you can smell what they're smelling. The descriptions there are done so well by the characters. It's some of the best little bits of dialogue that describe the world around the characters themselves, that describe the world around Deacon, your playable character, that really add to that experience and really bring to life the zombies, the zombie threat that exists in this world. Now, there's also some stuff going on with the story, and I won't spoil any of it. And as much as I'm, not at all for the devs being really keen on, they're not zombies, they're freakers. They're very clearly zombies. If you want to tell me that the people in the world of Days Gone refer to them as freakers, just like in World War Z, there's Eeks and Zeds in some other games and other zombie lore, that's fine, but don't try and argue with me that they're not zombies. There's some form of a zombie. But that said, the devs have actually created writers have actually created a pretty interesting story, a background that you get to uncover over time with some of the game's story missions that give the zombies some interesting lore. I think, not anything hyper original, but the way it's presented slowly over time does really add to that sense of horror and terror. And again, this is a big part of this game's slow progression call. It takes 15 hours before a lot of these things start to sink in, start to become aware to the player, where I think at that point the atmospherics of Days Gone really get cranked up to 11. Because for the first 10 hours of the game, you're kind of oblivious to most of the things I'm talking about. I mean, the music might do it for you, and you might run into a freaker horde, but the whole puzzle doesn't really come together until much later on, because everything is just slow dripped to the player at a very, very slow rate. So a lot of good stuff happening here. I think the last piece, though, that kind of, ties back into this concept of survival horror that I've been talking about is actually the motorcycle itself. It's not incredibly difficult to maintain it, but again, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where it's not incredibly difficult to deal with a small, horde of zombies, a handful of zombies, but once you face larger numbers, you're pretty much guaranteed to die if you're not prepared for it. The bike is kind of the same way. It's not that difficult to keep fuel in it, but make that mistake and you will pay dearly, having to walk to the nearest gas station or nearest town in hopes that you find a gas canister laying around and then walk it back to your bike to give it fuel, all the while possibly attracting freakers. The bike is also a really great mode of transportation for a survival horror experience because you're not fully protected on a motorcycle like you might be in a car that you could potentially cover in armor plating or bits of scrap to further protect you from the freaker hordes. The bike leaves you exposed while still providing you with that mode of transportation and that option for escape if you plan accordingly. This really is a game about planning. Like, everything can go terribly, terribly wrong if you don't consider your actions, if you don't really plan them out. And that's what I love about it. It's honestly that small bit of its survival horror design that has kept me coming back playing it 15, 20 hours on. I do think that all of those gameplay designs could be strengthened and made better, but what's here is still pretty freaking amazing, and I really do think Bend has done something special with the idea of a proper survival horror open world game. It's not something that I think it's going to translate for everyone, especially if you really find a deep disdain for a lot of the more mundane activities that the game forces upon you, but if you enjoy what's there and you don't mind like a good old, more traditional, more dated open world romp, I do think you'll also find these survival horror elements, and they will definitely expand your enjoyment for Days Gone. This is a franchise, or I guess you could say a original IP, a new IP, that I'm very glad had a chance to exist. I'm also very glad to hear that it's selling really well in the UK. It's selling decently well here in the US. It's far from an amazing game, but it is a good game at the end of the day, with some flaws and some unoriginal writing and dull characters, but there's still bits to love here, and some of my favorite games have been 6s and 7s, and I'm okay with Days Gone being probably a 6 or a 7. I do genuinely hope, though, that Ben gets an opportunity to make a sequel to this at some point in the future. It doesn't even have to be with Deacon. It can be with another character who also makes use of a motorcycle. Expand those survival systems via the motorcycle and make the motorcycle a larger part of the narrative. If I had to go back to discussing some of my criticisms of this game, it's the fact that the motorcycle goes from being a key portion of the narrative very early on to just another thing in your equipment, another thing in your toolbox, if you will, that's very easy to upgrade and is really only upgraded through, again, incessant and often annoying grinding of currencies and reputation. I want to see the bike play a bigger part in the story. I want to see it be a character all its own. As someone who's been riding motorcycles since I was 4, I know that motorcycles have that power, and in the zombie apocalypse where this thing is keeping you alive a lot of the time, it deserves to have that sort of a role. So here's to Bend Studios having another chance to bring us more Days Gone in the future, with hopefully not another 7-year development cycle where they can maybe be a little bit less ambitious with how they decide to give players an opportunity to tell their story, and maybe deliver something a little bit more special, a little bit more fleshed out the next time around. Feel free to leave some of your own thoughts on Days Gone if you've been playing it down in the comment section below. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one.